Time goes by fast, doesn't it? That's a horrible video to watch when you've got a daughter who's going into high school in 3 months. And I know some of you guys are in the same situation. You have children who are graduating high school, going off to college, maybe graduating college, maybe going into kindergarten for the first time. And time goes by so fast. In fact, there's this guy who writes the book of James. And he says this, he says, "Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit. Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes." That is depressing. That is sad to think about how fast life goes, and life does go by real fast. Life is a string of phases, and none of the phases last forever. We're in this series called It's Just a Phase, so don't miss it. 2 weeks ago, we talked about the retirement phase of life. Last week, Doyle talked about the adulthood phase of life. And today we're going to talk about the adolescent phase of life. And each of these phases, they go by so fast, and we have to make sure that we're not missing it. Now, today when we're talking about adolescence, I want you to know that adolescence is actually the age between 12 and 25 years old. Most people think it's just the teenage years, but adolescence goes much farther than the teenage years now. So if you are 25, don't think you're in the adult phase yet. Biologically, stuff is still changing in your mind. That technically you're still in adolescence. So that's what we're going to be talking about for that phase. And I love the adolescence phase because it's such an important phase, but it's one of those phases that we think we can miss. That it's one of those phases that we think we can just close our eyes to what's happening in the adolescent years. We love the childhood years because everybody's so cute. We love the adult years because that's when we've solidified who we are. Retirement years is all the fun, but adolescent years, nobody wants to look at the adolescent years, do they? And I know this is true because when you look at a picture of yourself as a middle schooler, your tendency is to close your eyes, isn't it? When for some reason a yearbook pops out and you see yourself back in high school, you're like, oh no, what was I thinking? Wearing that, doing that with my hair, what happened? In fact, the way I visualize adolescence, it's like, have you ever been sitting at a stop sign and seeing two cars heading right for each other? And you just know they're going to hit. That's what adolescence is. That's what watching adolescence is. It's like watching childhood and adulthood come screaming in and just colliding together in this mass wreck of carnage called adolescence. It's a beautiful thing, right? I know this because, in fact, I used to be an adolescent, believe it or not. And before that, I was a child. And so this is what I looked like in my childhood years. This is a picture of me in kindergarten. Oh, thank you. I love the awes that you gave me. People thought that as well when I was growing up. They looked at that and they're like, oh, look at that little smile and that perfect complexion and the hair. I've still got the same haircut that I did when I was in kindergarten. But those years were good years. Things were great. Things were beautiful. And obviously, I enjoy my life now, but something in between happened, and I'm not exactly sure what happened in the adolescence years. I began to look like this. Don't laugh. I was seeing pictures of you in middle school. Middle school is tough. This is my 6th grade year. It was crazy. Like, I don't know what happened in that year. I don't know what I was thinking, but everything began to change. And in fact, if I was to describe the middle school years, the high school years, the college years in one word, it would be the word change. Everything changes. All at the same time. It's all this wreck of carnage that happens on you and in you. Like your mind begins to change. Like physically, you begin to change. In adolescence, my hair began to grow like crazy, and I thought it was cool, and I had all this long hair. My skin began to change. So like physically, I began to get all these pimples all over me, and it's because I didn't shower and didn't care, and I just smelled bad, and like I was extremely short, and all the other people were growing really tall. Emotionally, I began to change as well. You remember the adolescence years years, all the tears that came along with those years. Like, I grew up in the 90s, and so in the 90s, like, I would sit in my bedroom and listen to the Tony Rich Project of, I'm crying inside, but nobody knows it but me. And like, life was hard. Like, everything just made me, I'd be sitting in math class, and the teacher would say something about some shape, and I would just start crying. I didn't know what was happening inside of me, but emotions were changing, and then relationships, they all began to change. Like, I began to like girls for the first time, and going to school was great, not because of the work, but because of the girls were going to be there. And so I began to like them, and they began to hate me, and relationships just got real complex. And relationally at home, my relationship with my mom and dad changed. In the childhood years, I thought mom and dad were awesome. They were fun to hang out with. I enjoyed going on vacations with them. I enjoyed sitting and watching things with them. And then the adolescent years came, and relationally, I didn't want to be around them as much anymore. I wanted to be with my friends. I wanted to hang out with people that were cool. I didn't want to hang out with them. And everything began to change all at once, and adolescence just came screaming in like a car crash happening inside of me. Adolescence phase is an intense phase of life. But it's such an important phase of life. It's one of those phases that we can't miss. Adolescence is the phase, it's the last time that the cement is moldable of our lives. It's the last preventative phase before we get into adulthood. Everything that you are now, everything that you enjoy, everything that you like, your personality, all of that was cemented in your adolescent years. In those years, that's the last time you can really mold a personality, mold likes and dislikes and interests, and it also molds the good parts of you, and it also molds the bad parts of you. There's a lot of you who are struggling with stuff today because of the decisions you made as an adolescent. Now, you can change in the other phases. I've experienced that. You've experienced that, where God does some awesome work in us, and it changes us. But that takes breaking the cement up. It takes a painful process of tearing us apart to rebuild us back together. And so we need to make sure that we don't miss this phase. But a lot of us who are parents, a lot of us in society, we miss this phase, and it's a frustrating thing for me as someone who loves pouring into the next generation, who loves strategizing for the next generation. It frustrates me that so many people put this phase on pause. That as soon as someone becomes an adolescent for some reason, we want to put on pause, especially their faith development. When they're children, we pour into their faith, we bring them to church, they don't even get an option, we read them the Bible, we pray with them at bedtime, and then they become teenagers, they become high schoolers, they go off to college, and we put that on pause for more important things, like education and grades. We put it on pause for sports and clubs and friendships. And all of that solidifies into who they become, and then we wonder why when they're out of high school, they're into college, they're into adulthood, that they're not as keen on the faith as they once were. We can't miss this phase. So here's what I want to do. Just over the next few minutes that we have together this morning, I want to give you two things that we need to keep our focus on during this phase. And there are two things about adolescence that you need to know. The first one is this. Adolescence is a phase where we reaffirm our beliefs. Adolescence is a phase where we reaffirm our beliefs. Now, this all starts with the mind. And when we're talking about an adolescent mind, have you ever looked at a teenager, an adolescent, a college student, and asked this question? Have you lost your mind? Anybody ever said that maybe to their own kid? Yeah, right? Has anybody's mom ever said that to you when you were going through the adolescent phase? Have you lost, what were you thinking, right? Like during that phase, there's so many times we look at the decisions they make, the things that they do, the things that they think, the things that they say, the things that they don't do, and we're like, what were you thinking when you did that? What were you thinking when you didn't do that? And we ask ourselves, have they lost their mind? Guess what? They have lost their minds. That's why they act that way. So I want to give you a little illustration of what I'm talking about. So in the adolescence phase, the prefrontal cortex part of the brain, which is that part right behind your forehead, that part that makes up your personality, that part that defines your interests, that part of your brain that also defines your decision making, all of that part of the brain in adolescence begins to change, and they begin to lose that mind. Now, when you're a kid, everything's wonderful and everything's great, and you make all the right decisions. But those decisions come from the parents teaching you, right? Like I know for my kids, I taught them things. Like I said, this is the ABCs, and that's an important thing to keep in your mind. This is the 1, 2, 3s, and we taught them how to count. We taught them to always listen to adults and always be respectful and always to say sorry, and they get that. And one of the things that happens in the brain of a child is they develop all these neurons of the brain, like way more brain cells than you could ever use, like millions upon millions. And that's why kids always ask the question, why? 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 It's because they have all this new cells in their brain, and they're trying to fill it up with little pieces of information. But then along comes the adolescent years, and they begin to lose their minds. Literally begin to lose their minds. This is what happens during the adolescent years. They take all that information that we taught them as a kid, and it needs to transfer from a child's brain into an adolescent's brain so that it can become an adult brain. And essentially what happens is that all that information, all those right decisions, all that respect that we taught them, it begins to try to be poured into the adolescent brain, and it gets messy. Like they start to lose their mind all over the place. The things that we taught them, I taught you to be respectful. How could you not be respectful in that instance? It's because they lost their minds in the transfer of information of the adolescent brain. When you ask them, how could you not do your homework? I don't know. Like, didn't I tell you to go clean your room, and then 5 seconds later you sit on the couch in front of the TV and start typing on your phone? Did you not hear what I told you to do? I don't know. Guess what? They don't know. They got lost somewhere in the process. Now what happens in the transfer of this information is something a little more complex than just pouring it into a backpack. What's actually happening with those cells inside of the brain is it goes through a process of preparing for adulthood. And the preparation of that is actually all those little pieces of information in the individual brain cells, and in those neurons, there's this little road that connects all of our brain cells together called synapses. And during this time, those little roads of information that sends information from one cell to the other, to the other, to the other, they begin to go through a construction process where instead of being roads, when you get into the adolescent years, it turns into super highways of information, where information that you have in your brain, it begins to travel at 200 times the speed that it did when it was a child. Now, for most of you, most of your brain cells, I would hope, have already gone through this process, and all of the decisions you make, you can make decisions really, really fast. And you know that decisions are dependent on other parts of life as well. So you can make a career decision. At the same time, you're thinking about your family. At the same time, you're thinking about your hobbies. At the same time, you're thinking about a whole bunch of different things because all the information travels really fast. For an adolescent, they're just starting to get that ability. It's slow-moving processes. They look like adults, and they're turning into adults. But anytime you're doing road construction, turning a road into a highway, for those of you ever driven on 70 or 64, you understand that road construction causes lots of problems and everything gets lost in the process, right? Now something else happens with that information. All this information that you learned as a child, all these brain cells that you got, not only is the connection between them getting faster, but your brain is also starting to make decisions on what to keep and what to get rid of. Because there's way too many. You don't need that many. And so it begins to go through a process called pruning. And basically pruning is a use it or lose it strategy that the brain uses. The brain looks at all these pieces of information that you've given, like, oh, your parents taught you the ABCs. We use letters, we use language all the time, so I'm gonna keep that in my new brain. I'm gonna use that for the rest of my life. And we learned about math. I personally did not use that very much. And so my brain said, you're never gonna understand that. And it just got rid of it. Now there's other things that are really important. And what your brain says is, the more you use it, this is what solidifies in your brain. If you use it, we're gonna keep it and the cement's gonna become dry and it's gonna be a part of who you are for the rest of your life. If we don't use it, we're gonna toss it to the side. And you can find it later. You can, in other phases of life, you can go searching for it and make it part of it, but it's gonna be much harder. For those of you who are really into sports, and really good at sports. During those adolescent years, the brain said, we're going to keep that skill. Some of you were never good at sports, and art was your thing or music was your thing, and so your brain got rid of that ability and kept the artistic stuff. Now, this is something really important to understand, and the reason that we're talking about this is because this has huge implications for faith development. Because here's what I know that a lot of you guys have experienced as a child, or maybe you're experiencing now with your child, where your parent comes along and they pray with you, or they take you to Sunday school, or they're reading the Bible to you, and they're putting that information into your brain about God loves you, and they make it a part of who you are in your childhood. That we love you, and they make it a part of your childhood. Or that Jesus Christ, he died for us, and he's real, and they make it part of the childhood. And then along comes adolescence, where the brain begins to look at that information that you've put in. And they begin to do something for the very first time. Adolescents gain the ability to question and doubt information. And this isn't a thing that they were able to do in childhood. You would put it in there and they would just accept it as fact. Now in the adolescent brain, they begin to question and doubt everything. Is math useful? Do I need to keep this in my brain? Yes, we'll put it in. No, we'll get rid of it. But they also ask that question to the stuff we teach them about faith. Is God really loving? And they ask questions for the first time. I know mom said he is. I know dad said he is. Is Jesus real? Does prayer really work? And during this phase, adolescents begin to question and doubt everything. And this is crucial. And it's also scary. For adolescents, for the first time, they're saying, well, maybe this isn't true, what they said about God in church or at home. And it's frightening because most adolescents start to have these questions, but they don't feel like they have someone they feel comfortable with asking those questions too. If I ask mom and dad, they're gonna panic and think I'm leaving the faith. I can't ask those at church because I gotta pretend like I know everything, and I just gotta believe in faith without asking questions. And so they keep those things quiet. And then it's crucial for parents because parents look at it as like they're bad parents. Like, if I was a good parent, if I did all the right things, my kid wouldn't question Jesus. And that's not true. Questioning and doubting is all part of transfer of information into an adolescent brain. And questioning and answering is not a bad thing. In fact, it's natural. It's not a sign of bad parenting. It's a sign of turning into an adolescent. There's this lady, Kara Powell. She's the executive director of a research institute in California, and she says this about doubt when it comes to faith. She says, doubt isn't toxic to faith, but silence is. Doubt isn't toxic. A lot of us think if you've got doubts, then that means that your faith is falling apart. And that's not true. If you've got doubts, that means there's stuff to learn. Where it becomes toxic is if you have doubts in your mind and you have nobody to help you determine whether this is something to keep or something to get rid of. And so we've got a lot of teens, a lot of people in the adolescence phase who have those doubts, have question about what do I do with this? Do I keep it or do I get rid of it? And we have to surround them with people who aren't afraid of their doubts. You know what? Jesus can handle our doubts, don't you? You understand that? Jesus knows the things that are going on in your head. And Jesus can handle your doubts. In Mark chapter 9, we get this great story of, just previous to this, Jesus has this awesome experience on the Mount of Transfiguration where he shows a few of his disciples his full glory. He's on this spiritual high. He comes down to the mountain. At the bottom of the mountain, all the people around are doubting. Like, he's got his disciples down at the bottom of the mountain. They're trying to heal this father's son who's got this disease, and he doesn't know what to do about it. And the disciples, they can't do it, and nothing's changing. And then this father begins to doubt all this information that he learned when he grew up, that I thought God answers prayers. I thought that Jesus' disciples could heal my son, and he's not seeing any change. And so we see this in Mark chapter 9. Flip open there real quick. Mark chapter 9, starting with verse 22. The father, after Jesus comes down, he asks Jesus this question. He says, if you can do anything, he starts with the word if, like there's seeds of doubt in there. Jesus, if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us. And Jesus said to him, if you can, all things are possible for one who believes. Immediately, the father of the child cried out and said, I believe. Help my unbelief. The father was basically going to Jesus to say, I've got things that I believe. There's things that I hold on to fast, and I'm going to keep those things. But there are other things when it comes to you, Jesus, that I don't believe because I've never experienced it. Now, if you can do something with this, please help me. And I love this as the father cried out. He didn't pull Jesus along in the shadows of the story. He didn't pull Jesus off aside and secretly ask him this question. He knew that doubt wasn't toxic. He knew silence was. And so he cried out, I believe, but help my unbelief. And I believe that's the cry of the adolescent generation right now. Is that there's a whole lot of stuff I believe, and a lot of times we look at the adolescent generation like they're just a group of skeptics and we just need to abandon them and just forget this generation ever happened because they have doubts, but they believe. But they need someone to step into a relationship with them and help them with the things that they don't believe. And that's what this guy was crying out to Jesus. And Jesus goes on to say, I'm the guy for you. I can handle your doubts. And he actually heals the man's son in that moment. We have to be willing to step into this generation, step in this phase, and not let them miss it. So how do we actually make the most of this phase? How do we make the most of the adolescence phase? I want to give you a few tips here. Number one is don't push pause on faith development. Never push pause on faith development, particularly at this moment, this critical juncture of growing up. I know there are a lot of important things in an adolescent's life that they need to experience or life will just be worthless. Things like homework, things like getting to school on time, things like not missing school, things like sports, things like club, things like social life. A lot of times what we do is we push pause in those moments so that the kids can experience something else. We can't push pause on faith development. The moment we push pause on the faith development is the moment we put that kid and their questions in silence. And we say, I know you've got questions, but let's not deal with that question right now because we want to get you in sports. We want to get you into clubs. We want to get you into perfect A's because that's so important. And the kid is thinking, all right, let's go do those things instead. We can't hit pause during the adolescence phase. One of the other things I would recommend is that your family and even this church become the safest place to ask any question. That's what God intended of the family. That's what God intended of the church. Is that anybody, no matter what your struggle, what your belief, what your unbelief is, that you can come into this setting, you can go into your life group, you can sit around the kitchen table, and there is freedom to ask any question. To sit around and to help a child say, this is something I've got a question about and I don't know what to do with it, and then us not to freak out about it and think that all is lost. Because what they need is to be able to figure out the answers to these questions and then put it in their bag. And once they do, they begin to own all that information that we've taught them. All that information that we hope they would keep for the rest of their life. It actually becomes theirs. One of the things that we need to do is help them own their faith. Own their faith. Make it theirs. Not mom's, not dad's faith, not Harvester Christian Church's faith, but this is mine. All these things in my bag, I've asked questions about, and I feel comfortable keeping, and I've made it my own. Someone else put it in my bag initially, but eventually we need to help them own it. And the way you do that is surrounding them with a faith community of people who can help them answer their questions. What I love that happens next is they actually take that bag of information and they do something really special with it. And that's what I want to talk about number 2 here. Adolescence is a phase where we mobilize our faith. Adolescence is a phase where we mobilize our faith. You see, in the first part of adolescence, we're filling up the brain with our faith and all that information about faith. But whenever you get into the high school years, when you get into the college years, and even the very beginning stages of your career years, you begin to take that stuff with you wherever you go. You know, adolescence in those latter years is all about freedom, right? All about freedom. That's what we look forward to when we're growing up. The day we finally get the keys to the car, right? Hopefully, you get those after you get your license. I know that wasn't true for a lot of you. But hopefully you get the keys to your car and you get the freedom to just drive away from your house and go to Walmart yourself. That was the first thing I was looking forward to doing when I got my driver's license. I don't know about you. But there's a freedom where you can actually go places without mom and dad driving you. And then you graduate high school. And there's freedom with that diploma. That's all my past. I get to choose where I go next. And then you go to college and you move out of your parents' house and you make decisions on your own. And there's so much freedom that comes along with that. And they pack up their bags full of everything that we've taught them in the faith, and they begin to use their freedom to look for a meaningful direction. And that's what they're doing with this backpack that they filled up. They take this and they go on this journey of looking for meaningful directions. In fact, adolescents are asking this question in the later years. They're asking the question, how can I matter? That's the question they're asking for the rest of their lives. In this moment, the big question that they're trying to figure out is, how can I matter? Like, how can I have a meaningful career? Like, what college degree do I choose that can be meaningful? How can I have meaningful relationships? How can I leave behind the middle school, boyfriend, girlfriend stuff, high school stuff? How can I actually get into a meaningful relationship? They're also asking, how can I have a meaningful faith? How can I have meaning? In church, we have a huge answer to the question of how can I matter? We've got a huge answer to that. And so adolescents in the room, I want you to hear this. If you want to matter, if you want to do some exciting things with your life, if you want to go into this world and see the world changed and you want to be used to do it, here's how you matter. Follow Jesus. Follow Jesus. If you want to matter, follow this guy. Like, he is someone who wants to make a difference in this world, and he wants to use you to do it. Jesus is so much more than information that you get on Sunday school. I mean, our small group classes are great. Memorizing scripture is great. We should do those. But Jesus is so much more than that information. Jesus uses that information to make it your own so that he can send you into this world, so he can mobilize your faith to do things that matter. If you're sitting around with a backpack full of information and you're not going anywhere, you completely miss the point of what Jesus called you to do. Jesus wants to mobilize your faith. Matthew 28, we get this great picture of Jesus mobilizing his disciples. There's 11 disciples now because one of them died. But these 11 disciples, right before Jesus goes off to heaven, Jesus gathers them together on this mountain and he wants to give them the Great Commission. And I'm sure many of you who grew up in the church your whole life, you probably even memorized this passage from 18 to 20. But I actually want to start with verse 17 because we skip verse 17 because there's some things in the church where we feel like we can't talk about. But I want to hit that one. So turn over to Matthew 28, and I want to read starting with verse 17. So Jesus, he just died. He rose from the dead. Everything that he came to earth to do was accomplished. And then it goes on to say this. When they saw him, when the 11 disciples saw him, they worshiped him. But some doubted. We skipped that part, right? Because we're like, uh-oh, what do we do with that? Some doubted. Like, these people are the 11 disciples. These are the ones that were with Jesus his entire ministry. They saw him walk on water. They saw him heal people. They saw him crucified, be put in a tomb, and then 3 days later, somehow he rose again. And then he walks on earth with him for 40 days after that. And now we get to this point where they worship him, rightly so, but then it says some doubted. And I know what some of you are thinking. Doubting Thomas, right? Yes, doubting Thomas. That's why. But it says some. It doesn't say one of them doubted. So it was more than Thomas. There had to at least been two. And so we get to this point where Jesus is looking at his 11 best friends who've seen everything. They've gotten all the information in there. He's getting ready to leave these people in charge of the future of the world. And he looks at a few of them, and some of them are doubting already, doubting still. And you know what Jesus does to them, even the ones who doubted? He says, you're exactly who I'm looking to use. And so he goes on and he gives them this message. It says, Jesus came and said to them, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. You go therefore and make disciples of all nations. He's saying, even though some of you are doubting, I can use you. I need you to take that information. In fact, here's how I'm going to answer some of your doubts. I'm going to have you take your doubts, and then I'm going to mobilize your faith and mobilize your doubts. And the way you're going to get the answers to your doubts is by actually doing what I ask you to do. I know it doesn't make sense, but I'm going to ask you to go and do what I ask you to do. And that's when you're going to get your answers. And so Jesus actually mobilizes the community of Christians. Adolescents, if you want to matter, follow Jesus. Jesus didn't die on the cross and rise from the dead so you can go to heaven. Jesus died on the cross, rose from the dead so you can go into the world and bring heaven to earth. And he wants to do something through you that matters. And that's what he's asking us to do. Last week, Solomon, we talked about Solomon. Doyle talked about him. And with his conversation about Solomon, one of the things that we found is that Solomon he got to the end of his phases of life. He was in the adulthood, maybe in the retirement phase. And he looked at everything in his past, everything he'd accomplished up to that point, and he actually sums it up in these words. He says, everything is meaningless. That's a sad way to end, and Doyle talked about that phase. And he said that Solomon said that everything was meaningless, and I believe the reason Solomon thought everything was meaningless was because maybe in his adolescent years, he was asking the wrong question. Solomon wasn't asking, how can I matter? Solomon was asking, how can I make more money? How can I be the richest man in the world? And you know what? Solomon became one of the richest men in the world. He had gold, he had buildings, he had real estate, he had everything. And as he looked back on it, as he looked over it, he said, everything is meaningless. This is all worthless. Solomon was also asking the question, how can I be happy? That's, for some reason, the question that we want to pursue in America. How can I just be happy? My kids, I just want them to be happy. That's all I want them to be. And we feel like this is a grander question to ask, but it's not. Solomon, he was asking the question, how can I be happy? And so he was searching all over the world for different things that he can put into his life, put into his bag that would make him happy. And he's like, well, maybe success, maybe fame will make me happy, maybe women will make me happy. So he married like 700 of them, and he had all these things together, and he got to the end of his life and realized that the pursuit of happiness was meaningless. That he could never grab a hold of it. Well, maybe he was pursuing success. He became one of the successful kings. But here's what I know. If these questions, how can I make more money? How can I be happy? How can I be successful? If those are the questions that mobilize you into adulthood, you're going to end up in the same place that Solomon ended up. Looking back over your life and saying, everything is meaningless. And my hope is that you don't climb the ladder of success only to get to the top to realize that you climbed the wrong ladder the whole time. If you want to live a meaningful life, answer this question. How can I matter? If you want to live a long and fulfilling life, struggle with your doubts now. Ask those questions now, and do it in a community of believers who love Jesus, who are willing to step in and help you with those questions. And then don't figure out how to make money. Don't figure out how to be happy. Don't figure out how to be successful. Figure out how you can make a difference in this world. And that's where you're going to find the joy of your life. That's whenever you're going to get to the end of your phases and be able to look back and say, everything isn't meaningless, and my life mattered. Spend your life, your one life, on something that matters. Grab a hold of Jesus. Grab a hold of your faith. Grab your backpack of everything that is meaningful, and then go into the world and make a difference. One of the things I love about Harvester Christian Church is we've got a great student ministry program that understands what's happening in this phase of life. I know a lot of people look at student ministry as they're just trying to have fun, they're just trying to be goofy, and they're just trying to build big crowds, but it's so much more than that. I mean, that might be some of the veneer. We want to have fun for that phase, but we really are passionate about how can we take the things, especially in the middle school years, and our middle school pastor, Matt Slater, who you just met, he does this great on Wednesday nights. How can we take these things that were passed on to these middle schoolers by their parents, by their Sunday school teachers, these important things, and how can we create an environment on Wednesday nights where we can evaluate those and ask questions? So on Wednesday nights, they teach, but they also put middle schoolers in a circle of people with an adult who can look at those questions. And the middle schoolers can feel free to ask anything they want. They can question God. They can question Jesus. They can question prayer. And in a safe environment in the middle school ministry, they're able to say, these things are important. Our leaders are able to look at our teens and say, you know what, that's something that I understand why you're questioning it. And I didn't get it at your age either. But now that I'm a little bit farther along the road, I understand why that's important. So my recommendation to you would be to keep that and put it in your bag. This Wednesday, in fact, we got a handful of middle schoolers who the first time are going to take those little bits of information and turn it into faith, and they're going to give their lives over to Jesus for the first time in baptism. And I'm excited to be able to watch them take what you guys have put into their hearts and then to put it in their bag so they can be mobilized with the faith. And then in high school, we've got a great high school pastor, Nick Ballard, one of my real good friends, and he does a great job in high school where he actually takes what they've learned in middle school, all the backpack of stuff that they filled out, and he asks the questions, how can we help our high schoolers mobilize their faith and show them that they can matter in this world? And so actually a few weeks ago, we do this event every single year called Mission Week, where over the spring break, we had about 60-some high schoolers this year give up their spring break. And some even gave up school because they weren't on spring break. They're like, forget it, I'm skipping school to do this. And so, because we didn't want to push pause, they decided to hit fast forward really fast. And so they give up their spring break to do something that mattered. And so some of them went to Haiti. Some of them went to inner city Nashville. Some of them went to rural Missouri where they helped in a children's home. And they took everything that they've been learning, they took their faith, they took those lessons, they took those memory verse, and they did something that matters, and they went out into the world. And then we talk about how whenever they go to college and when they choose their careers, they can actually do the same thing, how they can do that in their neighborhoods, how they can mobilize their faith. This Monday, we're taking a group of college young adults downtown St. Louis to work with the homeless and just to hear their stories and to build a relationship with them, because we want to do things that matter. Adolescence is a phase that we can't miss out on. It's an important phase. Now I've got a question for you as we wrap up here. If I could give you a time machine, and with this time machine, you could use it to go back and relive your adolescent years, would you do it? Would you do it? No, you would not do it, right? Nobody in their right mind wants to go back to the adolescent phase and relive those years of being picked on, being made fun of, your arms are longer than the other arms, and pimples, and all this emotional change is going on. Nobody wants to go back there and live those years. Now, if I switch the question up, how would you answer this question? If I could give you a time machine, and you could use that time machine to go back to those adolescent years as yourself and give your adolescent self advice, would you do it? In a heartbeat. In a heartbeat. I would love to go back to 13-year-old Nikomas and say, I know this is a rough time, but you can make it through. And things are going to be great in the other phases. You just got to keep pushing through. And I'm sure you'd love to do the same. I'm sure some of you would like to go back to yourself in those adolescent years and say, don't worry about what all the other people are saying about you. I know that's a big deal to you right now, but don't worry about the way they're picking on you, the way they're making fun of you, the way they're calling you names. Don't let that become who you are. You're so much bigger than that. Some of you would like to go back to your adolescent self and say, stay away from that relationship. Or stay away from that addiction. Because if we mess with that stuff now, that's going to become a part of who we are for the rest of our lives. And I'd love to have the opportunity to go back and just sit with myself and give myself advice. I'd love to be able to go back and say, Jesus is so important. Don't put him on pause for baseball, for football. Nikomas, you're going to be 5'8" and 140 pounds. You have no hope to play football. Go. Spend some time with the Word, because this is stuff that's going to last for the rest of your life. This is stuff that you're going to need to have cemented and part of who you are for the rest of your life. Don't push pause. The unfortunate reality is none of us can go back. It's just a phase. And some of us have missed it. But here's the good news. Even though that phase of life is over for you, it's not over for everyone. There are people going through that phase right now who need someone to go back in time, sit with them in a circle, and give them the advice that you would give yourself. To say, hey, maybe that's not the greatest of relationships. Hey, maybe that's not the pursuit that you want to go after. Hey, maybe Jesus is more than who you think he is. And we have the opportunity right now, no matter what phase we're in, whether it's adulthood or retirement, to go back in time, sit around in a group of people. Maybe it's at our own dinner table. Sit around with our own teenagers and help them struggle with their doubts. And say, man, I affirm your question. That's a valid question. Now let me tell you how I've experienced the reality of that answer to that question. Maybe you want to sit in a room of middle schoolers or sit in a room of high schoolers or college students and just go back in time and open the Bible with them and use your experience, the things that have been cemented in you that you want to help another generation skip out on, and you want to make a difference there. You see, adolescence is a hard phase, and they need someone to sit with them to sort through all of this information. And you can be the one that goes back in time and helps them decide, this is something worth keeping. Jesus is worth keeping. Your faith is worth keeping, and you can do that. And they need you to do that. Adolescence is just a phase. Do not let the next generation miss it. Let's pray. Father, I thank you so much for your love. I thank you for the way that you've expressed that through Jesus Christ. And God, I'm so thankful that Jesus is someone who he understands humanity because he walked in our flesh, he walked on our earth. God, he understands what we're going through, and he accepts us and brings us in. But God, I also thank you that Jesus is someone who molds us and shapes us and turns us into people who can be mobilized and do great things in this world. God, thank you for not leaving us the way we are. God, thank you for holding us. Thank you for changing us. Thank you for molding us. And God, right now I pray for the first steps of that to happen in this room. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen.